It makes me remember that I should record. So, yeah, so I'll just introduce you a little bit to Thurman, do a little bio background information. While I do that, I would like to start right after I do the kind of intro. I'd love to hear just kind of some broad reactions to the text. I'm curious what you thought of it, where you found it um, challenging and good, where you have some questions. I have lots of things that I feel like I could say about this text, but I want to make sure that I'm focused on some of the things that you all want to talk about in it. Because I think, how do I put it? Yeah, I think this is a text that uh, you need to kind of sit with and think about, because it's putting together some things maybe you haven't thought about in the same breath before. And I think for me, it's a very helpful text, but I can understand people needing to kind of get it at their own speed. So have your thoughts percolating while I do a kind of a brief intro, and then I'll ask for kind of reactions and broad feelings about the text. So Thurman was, let's see, he went to Morehouse College. If you're familiar with Morehouse, at least Morehouse people will tell you it's the preeminent men's African-American college. There's something to being a Morehouse man. If you know a Morehouse man, generally they are well-dressed, they are sharp. I had a professor in seminary who was a Morehouse man who carried himself in a certain way. And boy, Howard Thurman definitely embodies a Morehouse man. He was a valedictorian of his class in 1923. He went from there to Rochester Theological Seminary. And I won't bore you with all the seminary history, but if you know what is now called Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School, Colgate, and that's in Rochester, New York, but Colgate, Rochester, and Crozer were three separate schools once upon a time. Colgate being where, I think in Hamilton, right? Rochester being in Rochester, and Crozer was in Chester, Pennsylvania. And those three schools decided to merge into one. So Thurman was an alum of Rochester. Martin Luther King was an alum of Crozer. And Crozer has a huge impact on that area, the area of south of Philadelphia still. Like there's still kind of a strong Crozer connection. That's still an important part of, I think some of the artwork from Crozer when it sold went to the seminary that I went to in Eastern. So anyway, what is now CRCDS, he went to one of those schools, graduated in 1926. He pastored at a couple of small churches. If I'm not mistaken, I think he pastored in Oberlin, Ohio for a bit. And if you know much about Oberlin, there's a college there as well. Oberlin is a very kind of progressive college town in the middle of nowhere in Ohio. And in some ways feels a lot like Houghton in that there's a college in the middle of nowhere, except that Oberlin is probably as progressive and liberal as Houghton is conservative. So like it's a really strange feeling in the middle of rural Ohio. He went back and was offered a position teaching, a joint position at Morehouse and Spelman. So Spelman is kind of a women's college that kind of is a brother-sister school with Morehouse. So he had a job where he was teaching at both places, had tenure. So when you're a professor and have tenure, you don't always want to move, but then he was offered a position as dean of the chapel at Howard, which is in Washington, D.C., African-American college there. And then he left there to found an intentionally multi-ethnic church in San Francisco during World War II. So in the mid-40s, he went out there, planted this church. I forget what the church is called. Something like Church for All Nations or something. I mean, it had that kind of name. Again, I mean, there's a whole arm of the Wesleyan Church dedicated to thinking about multi-ethnic church planting. This was not there in 1944, so this was a really I don't want to say risky move. It again, he left a very prestigious position. If you're looking at wanting to do pastoral and academic work in historically Black colleges, being the dean of the chapel at Howard is about as high as you can get. And so to risk that and go to San Francisco and plant a church with a white pastor, that was a really challenging move for him. So he was there for about 8 or 9 years. And then Boston University came calling and offered him a position as dean of the chapel at Boston University. and he was the first African American to hold that kind of position in a majority white school. Boston University is kind of historically affiliated with the Methodists. At different times in its history, it's been more Methodist than others. But he was the dean of the chapel at Boston University starting in '53 until the '60s at some point. If you know your history, that's when Martin Luther King Jr. was a doctoral student at Boston University. So there's stories about Thurman and King meeting each other as professor and student, dean and student, and stories of them watching the World Series together in the '50s, sitting around telling stories. Incidentally, a little Houghton history here. Our president, Shirley Mullen, her father also took his doctorate at Boston University and actually was in a class with Martin Luther King. He told me it was a huge class. It was like 100 people, so he didn't get to know King very well. But obviously, King was already known at that point, and so to have a chance to be in a class with him was a real privilege. As you read Thurman, again, if you know much about King, you can see Thurman's fingerprints on the person that King became. And a lot of King's main theological themes, and even I think some of his imagery and some of his philosophy is just, it's the kind of thing, I think when I got my doctorate, I always imagined teaching in the classroom. And when I was offered a job as dean of the chapel, I thought, what can that do? And then looking at what dean of the chapel did to Martin Luther King, like that relationship made me think, there could be some real impact there. So Thurman's impact was huge on King. And I'll probably a few times as we're looking through the text, probably a few times I'll say, doesn't that sound like King? Doesn't that sound like King right there? Because they're, if you read it all, if you read King's work, Thurman's all over it. So that's a little bit about Howard Thurman and his history. He passed away, I believe, in the mid '80s, I want to say, mid to late '80s. He is sort of known as how do I put it, maybe a preeminent African-American mystic, which are not two titles that we often sort of put together. But he is definitely born out of the Black church, but definitely has this kind of spiritual formation emphasis that, again, one of the things that I think will be really helpful for you is to notice in how many ways he sounds like Henry Nouwen, who you read at the beginning of this. And he really holds two very different worlds together. And that's part of why I thought it's really important for us to read this book, because I think what he challenges us to think about together it's not something that often people think about in the same breath. For me, my personal introduction, just so you know, my personal introduction to Thurman was when I was in seminary, in the class of that Morehouse man. His name was Adetokunbo Adelakun. He was African-American, but born to Nigerian parents. So he had a very Nigerian name, but he was very African-American in his own kind of cultural. Well, I should say he kind of had both, right? He had both African and African-American kinds of feel to him because he was raised by Africans, but he culturally felt more African-American as he grew up. And he introduced me to Thurman in a class on the theology and ethics of Martin Luther King. So that was my background. And that class, those of you who went to Houghton as an undergrad heard me, I'm sure, talk about this class frequently. It was a very pivotal class for me because there were 21 of us, and only 5 were white and 16 were African American. And that's where I learned about what it felt like to be in the minority in a class and not sure if I should share my perspective or not, because my perspective felt different than the majority. And so I really wasn't sure, should I speak up? And had a very tender and wonderful professor, Adelakun, he said to me after class, Brother Jordan, I need to talk with you. And I came up and talked with him, and he said, it seems like you have things to say, and so I want you to say them. Don't be afraid to say them. And the class will tell you if you're wrong, basically. Listen to the feedback you get. That's okay, but don't be afraid to talk, or else we're not going to really have a conversation. That was a real gift to me. So for me, Thurman holds together a lot of the things that I care about very deeply. That seminary experience was very important to me. I did not learn about how to think about issues of diversity when I was a Houghton student. It came after Houghton for me, and realizing there's this amazing tradition in the African American church and the tradition of Christianity I grew up with that sometimes didn't really know anything about each other. And Thurman was kind of a bridge to help me begin to understand these two worlds together. So that's my kind of personal background with Thurman too, and why it's a privilege to kind of introduce him to you here. So all that said, that's his background and my background. I'm wondering your initial reactions to the text. And like Professor Adelikhan said to me, I'll say to you, like, it helps to hear what you're really feeling and thinking about it. Like if there are parts that you're like, I don't know, like, you know this, you never have to agree with everything you read, but it helps us to talk together about the things that were challenging. So I'd like to hear what you liked. I'd like to hear like what is still, in some of my classes we talk about finding a wow, a what, and a whoa. Wow, something I really loved. What, like, I'm still thinking about that. And whoa is not yet. I need to talk about this with, with some people I trust before I get there. So any reactions that you had as you took a peek through this text for the first time?
You know, it was, to me, it was traditional.
Yep.
It's how I grew up, my background, I grew up.
Yep.
And when reading it, you know, from the grandmother to everyone, and, you know, it just thinking about and how it was written back, you know, they're citing, I don't know, it was like the 60s or something.
I think this was published in 49, yeah.
49, well, 49. And to
right.
see today, when you look at all the unrest that's going on, that really nothing has really changed.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and when you were talking about how the minority, you were the minority in the class, that's how I always feel when I'm doing things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and and sometimes I wish I would have had somebody to tell me it's okay to say something, because when you look at this class, you know, here I am, the only African American. It makes you kind of like, you know, I shouldn't say, you know, let me just sit back, let me, you know, you be quiet, and you know, and so I wish I would have had somebody to say, just say what you have to say, you know, because you know, in your professional life, you know, you go places and you know, you're the only one, and I wish you would have had that, and you know, and I just I mean, it was really good. I really enjoyed it. Like I said, I could relate to a lot of the things, you know, from the things that you always got to be better. You know, we were always taught you got to be better. You know, you always got to be, you can't give 100%. You got to be better than, you know, because you're black. You know, you're black, so you got to be better than the others. You know, that's how we were kind of raised. And then, you know, the training, you know, like I said, like today, all the things that are going on, you know, and I have a son, and who's, you know, he's been pulled over a few times, you know, driving while black, you know, and so there's a special training that is involved, the extra that you have to do. I mean, my husband has been, you know, followed. I have been followed, you know, and I at the time I worked for the city of Jamestown, and I was followed. And when I got into a staff meeting, you know, I was a department head, and when I got in the staff meeting, I had the chief of the police say, "Why didn't you tell us you got a new car?" You know, like, whoa, you know. So why don't I got a new car? You know, but I could really relate to this because it was. I mean, it's just how I grew up. You know, it's just how. Yeah, so I'm enjoying this read.
Good. Did he sound? You said he sounded traditional to you. I mean, does it sound like a preacher you would have heard growing up at that? Yeah.
Yes.
He has that very kind of grandfatherly tone to me, but of course, it's a different tone for me. But
yeah, when I first started, you know, when I was younger, yeah, but now there's more, you know, some of the preachers, you know, they're a little more, they're not fire and brimstone, but they have that fire and brimstone attitude.
Yeah.
Like, you know,
yeah.
It's like, ooh, you know, they're just really like, when the spirit hits them, they always, you know, are always on that level of the spiritual level.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. That's good. I appreciate that, Victoria. Yeah. Pecores, did you have something to add?
I thought it was, when I first started reading the book, it was really kind of shocking because to me it seemed like he was pretty upfront. a lot of things of how really people are kind of set aside, but it was really interesting to me how he took Jesus and looked at it as he was born into a poor Jew. And he was in Palestine when it was mostly a Roman run area. And then he grew up untouched by the surge of currents in the common life made of mostly, so pretty much he grew up as a minority. Mm-hmm. And how his life probably was a lot like Black Americans' life, the way they grew up as being a minority. And I never really put those pieces together. I thought it was really interesting how he put that spin on it.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, it is. I think sometimes when we've been taught things like the plan of salvation, what we tend to do is sort of remove Jesus from his historical context and say his historical context was more or less ancillary. His real job could have been done in any culture at any time, but he came to sort of do it. But I appreciate him calling us back to who he was. It helps us to understand better what might be inflecting his tone and his choice of words along the way. So yeah, thanks, Brian, for that. Mary, what did you want to say?
At the bottom of page 3, in the story following that, when he was a delegate to a pilgrimage, and he was approached, he's having coffee with the principal, and the principal asked him, "What are you doing over here? What are you doing over here?" And this is what I mean. More than 300 years ago, your forefathers were taken from the Western coast of Africa as slaves. And one of your famous Christian writers made money of the sale of slaves. And then he goes on to say, "I'm Hindu. I do not understand. Here you are in my country, standing deep within the Christian faith and tradition. I do not wish to seem rude to you, but sir, I think you are a traitor to all the darker peoples of the earth. And I am wondering, you as an intelligent man, what can you say in defense of your position?" And I'm struggling through that because being people that have written, the view of Christians from this Hindu man, and how he said, you could have been from the trafficked people. There were Christians who made money off of slaves, and people who wrote songs like Amazing Grace. That's a popular song, but yet now it's tainted in the light that he, was a slave owner. It makes my heart really, really sad, and I'm struggling to get through, how he saw Christians and his viewpoint. And so there's just a lot to think and process through, and I'm not sure where I stand in listening and reading some of those stories.
Sure. Yeah, and so thanks for sharing that. That's a really vulnerable and good thing to share. And just so you know, like, you have time and space to process this here, and you're among friends as you process it. So, when you feel like I've got to say something, feel free to do that. I do think it's good for us. So much of what we're going to talk about, I think, is how spiritual formation helps us to do this kind of conversation, and the overwhelming impulse we sometimes have to run away from that reality. I appreciate you bringing up even John Newton and Amazing Grace. Like, the way that song functions for us, it's like, if that song appears to be anything tainted or wrong with it, we don't know what to do. It's like you can't attack Billy Graham, or you can't, like all these, like these people people or things that are very dear to us that we're not quite sure what to do with it when they're revealed to have feet of clay. But that's reality, right? Like, all of us have it, and so we do have to face those things. But I appreciate your kind of vulnerability in sharing this, Mary. It does take time to process. Others of you, any kind of initial reactions or thoughts? It just helps me to get the temperature of all of you. So Heather, yeah.
I actually really enjoyed that professor's perspective, because I've actually been struggling with really similar questions with everything that's going on in the country right now, and just trying to come to terms and be able to articulate exactly my response to those. So I'm really, really thankful for this book. It's very helpful to kind of sort through my thoughts and be like, oh yeah, actually that is what I'm thinking. I'm just never really been able to put it into words before. So it's really helpful to have someone as articulate and just well-spoken as him to be able to kind of sort through things for me and present it really, really well. And it's very, very timely, like you guys were saying. So it's helpful.
Yeah, good. Thanks for saying it. It is, those questions have a way of forcing their way into our lives, even if we run away from it. And I think you're right now, Heather, like this is a time when many people are asking the same thing about what do I see from Christians? If this is what I see from Christians, in what way do I want to be Christian? You know, and in what way do I think the whole thing, root and branch, is a problem and needs to be rooted out? I think that's a real question people are asking about us right now. And so it is helpful to have someone like him to point us through.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thanks, Heather. Anybody else? Kim, did you want to say something? Or
Yeah, one of the things that caught my attention is and just because recently someone had said something to me about how Paul was so close to being a saint, and I sometimes struggle with that kind of terminology, but one of the things that made me think when he wrote about kind of Paul being a minority with a majority privilege, and I hadn't really, even the whole Jesus thing about being a poor Jew, like I just hadn't considered that. And I believe because of who I am, I don't even look at things like that, as I should maybe. Mm-hmm. Like speaking into something that Victoria said about how I have a friend who's African American and he's young, but he makes me think of this gentleman by the way he speaks and his attitudes and things. But he won't even wear jeans because he feels that it just changes how someone looks at him as a black. And I think that's so sad to me to even have to think about how you dress.
yeah, thank you. I do think often what has happened, I think currently in the discussions around this, is that we get very hung up asking kind of sociological questions about things like privilege and saying, does privilege exist, and that kind of thing, without really just sort of focusing on the common sense reality that different people's lives are different. And there's a way probably, Kim, in which you, even though you're not African American, would be less likely to dress casually than I would for something, because I know that I followed a woman as a pastor, for instance, and when I would dress down coming into the office, they would say, Beth never dressed down like that. And I would often say, well, Beth couldn't get away with it because people would see a dressed down woman and think she's sloppy, whereas they see kind of a dressed down 24-year-old man and say, oh, he must be good with the kids, he must, you know, like he seems casual and cool, you know. And so that doesn't make anything, I'm not making any sociological definition about male privilege or anything. It's just, of course, it's common sense that people's lives are different. And Victoria's sort of sense of, I have to be better than, I mean, that's a real reality. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, Kim, because it again forces these questions to the center in a way that can be a little uncomfortable. But I think once we face them, we can come out on the other side ready to deal with that reality. I think we have power over it in a way we didn't before, thinking about it, processing it, and coming to some kind of resolution about it. So thanks. Anybody else with any kind of initial, I'll be pushing you for some questions throughout, but any initial things anybody else wants to say? All right, let me jump into sharing screen then, and we'll just walk through a few of the notes that I made on the opening part here. So thinking about this question first, and if you have an out loud answer, that's fine. If you don't, that's okay too. But what's the connection between your spiritual life and your desire to do the right thing? Does prayer or the spiritual life help you to do the right thing or not? So I often bring up this question, and I think I probably did at the beginning of this class too. I usually do in spiritual formation somewhere along the way. Talk about how the spiritual life often feels a little bit orphaned for us as Christians. We don't sometimes fully understand the purpose of it. If we believe functionally that the most important thing for Christians is to believe the right things, then that's better accomplished through a class than through the spiritual life. And if we're from the side of Christianity that emphasizes more about works, to say, you know, it's not so much important that you get jot and tittle of Jesus' life right, but you need to do the right thing. You need to do justice and love mercy. Often those folks don't really have a deep understanding of why the spiritual life helps either. You know, like if the goal is doing the right thing, then just do the right thing is what it feels, is what it often feels to, like if for example, if I were to go to some of the people protesting in Buffalo or Rochester now and say, you know, I mean, you should really develop a prayer life. That would likely be understood as kind of directing people away from action to do the right thing. It would be likely understood as kind of, I mean, it would be nice to have time to pray, but right now we're out here doing. We've got to do. There are things that need to be done. And often prayer is kind of, and I say the spiritual life in general, gets kind of bifurcated from no matter how you look at the faith. If you think of it as about belief, it gets separated from that. And if you think about it as actions, it gets separated from that. For me, well, let me ask you this. I mean, have you thought about this before? Like, have you thought about your connection between your spiritual life, praying, just put it that way, your prayer life with God, and doing the right thing in a moment? Like, if there is a connection, how would you describe that connection? Because I'll tell you, go ahead. Someone ready?
Yeah, I was going to say, I just had a Bible study.
Yeah.
And the question was asked, you're in a grocery store, you're in line, and you have an item in your basket, and you look down and somebody grabs that out of your basket, puts it in their basket. What do you do? You know, and that's what, you know, so when you were saying this, do you do the right thing? You know, do you jump into your flesh and say, hey, you know, that was my can of peas. You know, what do you think you're doing, you know? Or do you, you know, are you graceful? And, you know, do you show grace and you just allow it to happen? You know, because they were talking about you're witnessing, because now, you know, the way, you know, especially if maybe somebody's in the store that knows you, you know, and, oh, I thought she was a Christian. If you raise your voice, she was a Christian. Oh, you know, see, that's why I don't go to church. You know, and so it was all about, you know, the witness to make sure that, you know, we do the right thing. So I just thought it was interesting that we just kind of talked about that in our Bible study earlier.
Yeah, and often we treat that as if it's mostly a matter of making the right decision in a moment, as opposed to, I mean, what we've been talking about in these first few weeks together has been about developing a life with God that makes it intuitive to act like God in a moment. Right? Like that's what we've been talking about. And yet somehow it can seem real when we're thinking about the interpersonal situations, but it can be hard imagining what that would look like systemically. In other words, I think anyway, the vision of spiritual formation that Thurman lifts up, and I think it's consistent with what Nouwen has lifted up and what Evan Howard has lifted up and what Ruth Haley Barton is going to lift up in her next book, that it doesn't only enable us to walk through interpersonal situations and do the right thing, and it doesn't just help us to feel peaceful in a moment, but it actually helps us to think about ourselves as members of larger societies and act like a member of a larger society in a way that Jesus would, in a way that honors him, even when we're just thinking about who we are within a larger group. So this connection, like I say, for many people, the idea of connection between the spiritual life and social justice, those two things seem radically different. And again, I'm just speaking from experience here. Like when I was in seminary, there were the activists, right? And they were both conservative and liberal. Like I'm not saying it was one side or the other, but people who thought the most important thing was doing. And often they would be almost derisive of people who felt called to a life of prayer, or even that really wanted to think very much about worship, right? Like, I don't know how familiar you all are with a group called the Social Gospel Movement, but this happened in the latter part of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. If you're interested in Googling down the rabbit hole, you can learn about, basically it was a theological kind of response to industrialization, saying like, what does it mean that humanity is being understood more and more as just like a cog in a big wheel, and workers are being, you know, understood as basically replaceable, you know, and so they often were very strident about taking the side of labor versus capital and that kind of thing. And there were figures who basically tried to sort of say God is on the side of the people who are being sort of trampled on by these larger powers, right? Part of the reason why the social gospel didn't really take was because they never did well to kind of inculcate the way they thought into the ordinary life of ordinary Christians. They didn't write hymns generally. They didn't, Washington Gladden was the name of one of the key figures of that movement. And he said something once like, it's not going to do us to sing, what did he say? To sit in our shut up sanctuaries singing happy little canticles while the world around us goes to hell. That was his essential idea. And so because, all I'm saying, I'm lifting this up to you to say, like, often activists just think, what is there to do with the spiritual life? What does worship have to do with this? What does prayer have to do with this? It has nothing to do with it. But often those movements kind of burn themselves out, right? Anger can really only sustain you so long. And even righteous anger, like even a sense that I'm looking at this and I'm looking at it with the eyes of God and it makes me upset. Eventually, you just move on from that. And so Thurman, I think, is going to pick up a really helpful vision to say, look, if you want to do the right thing in society, you've got to get yourself right to be really helpful in that. So I think, sometimes people miss that there are kind of spiritual roots to the kinds of injustices that we're concerned about in our culture today. I mean, when we think about the things that make injustice seem possible or seem normal, these, I think, come down to a lot of the things that Henry Nouwen or Evan Howard would have talked about along the way. People don't listen well to each other. I had the good fortune last night to have a meeting and not watch the debate, but my understanding was that there was not a lot of listening well going on during that time, that there wasn't an attempt to listen to another person with an attempt to understand and respond in good faith. And of course, as a culture, we get the debates we deserve from our leaders, whether or not we like to admit that. And so, right, this is, again, we would recognize this in a marriage as a real problem, right? If we had a couple sitting in front of us and we were offering counseling to them and we said, the real problem here is that, husband, you don't listen to your wife in order to understand. You're listening in order to respond and win and conquer. But we don't somehow recognize how that also takes place at a societal level. This is a societal problem that has spiritual roots to it. We don't fully understand what we can do to solve problems because we're fixated on the question of whether there really is a problem or not. Like when we're talking about issues of all types, right? Like the temptation to, I appreciated Mary sharing what she did. I mean, the kind of discomfort we feel when having to think about these things often makes some of us say, there are not really problems here. There's nothing here to see. Stop getting so bent out of shape or so worried. That again can make injustice seem possible or normal. And again, if we're talking about an interpersonal situation, we would realize, again, if we're talking about a marriage, if the wife says there's a problem and the husband doesn't think there's a problem, there's still a problem. And vice versa. If the husband thinks there's a problem and the wife doesn't think there's a problem, there's a problem. Like when one partner thinks there's a problem, there's a problem. But often we get very hung up on societally on the question of there's not really a problem here. And that too has spiritual roots. Sorry, there was another point to that I must have left off. But the third thing to say with that is we play the same tired scripts over and over again. These things that never work, we continue to try it again and again. I appreciated Victoria saying like how timeless the text feels in a way, right? And I felt the same for some reason last summer. The Houghton College alumni Facebook page was running old pictures of homecoming parades. And there's a homecoming parade from 1968 with like a convertible with whatever, the homecoming queen sitting on the back of it. But there was a sign, maybe on a float. I don't think it was on the convertible, but maybe it was on a float near it or held up in the parade with the Republican symbol on it. And it said, vote like your life depended on it. And I was like, I mean, this could be 52 years later, just in terms of like this kind of existential threat that people are feeling, the way that we're sort of talking about this as an end times thing. So we just rehash the same scripts again and again. And again, if we're sitting down doing marital counseling, we would know, husband and wife, you keep doing this same thing again and again, you've got to try something different. And we would recognize it for the spiritual issue that it is. But as a nation, sometimes when we start talking about it as a systemic kind of thing, we think, oh, there can't be anything spiritual. It's all spiritual. It's all stuff that can be addressed by people who are in a healthy spiritual place. And so the connection here is really, really important to make, I think. We are better equipped to deal with these things when we know who we are in Christ. And again, I hope that one of the things you see again and again is that Thurman's prescription for what it is to get this is almost identical to Henry Nouwen. There's no evidence that they ever met, but I would love to just imagine Henry Nouwen and Howard Thurman sitting down and a couple of mystics, you know, talking back and forth, because they'd have fascinating things to say to them. So I want to jump into his interpretation of Jesus, but anything kind of on this intro stuff that anybody wants to feedback on, question, pushback, you want to say on that? All right, let me jump in then. So the first chapter here is called Jesus and Interpretation. And he starts right off by saying, this is a book for people whose backs are against the wall. So this would just be in the preface. The significance of the religion of Jesus to people who stand with their backs against the wall has always seemed to me to be crucial. The idea that most theology is not written for people whose backs are against the wall, for him is really a very crucial idea. He goes on at the beginning of chapter 1, many and varied are the interpretations dealing with the teachings and life of Jesus, but few of these interpretations deal with the teaching and life of Jesus have to say to those who stand at a moment in human history with their backs against the wall. Again, I would expect that this might push some of you out of your comfort zones in the fact that often when we talk about Jesus, we resist a kind of sociological thing here. Like, to say that Jesus means one thing to one group of people and one to another can kind of challenge us a little bit. Like if we're used to thinking about Jesus' main mission as merely kind of spiritual salvation, we think Jesus had one message that he brought to everybody. But when we look at the ways in which Jesus really did deal with people very differently, often depending on their social location, I think it's important to say, yeah, Jesus probably sounded different. Again, this is common sense, I think, once we drill down. But he probably sounded different to people whose backs were against the wall than he did to people who weren't. I mean, that's, you know, when we think about the way that he talked about the Pharisees, for example, he didn't have a lot of time for the Pharisees most of the time, right? And as close as we ever see Jesus to being cruel, it's to the Pharisees. Like, it's, you know, he's unafraid to sort of call them out. He's unafraid to call them whitewashed tombs and these kinds of things. He's unafraid to really put it very plainly, in a way that, you know, if you are one of these people with the backs against the wall and you look at Jesus saying this, your heart does a little backflip because you think, finally, someone sees who these people are to me and what they've been doing. And you know, you probably take a little bit of joy in it, and you probably don't even know if you should feel joy about it because that feels really wrong. But that sense of finally someone who is, you know, as was said about his mother, casting down the proud, sending the rich away empty, you know. And at the same time, the very clear eyes that Jesus had for people who were kind of the lowest in society. We spent a little time Monday night. There was a panel discussion that me and a couple other faculty were on, talking about this, and I talked about the story of the Canaanite woman in Matthew, where Jesus, this is the story that can be really painful about Jesus saying, you know, I wasn't sent to you, I was only sent to the lost sheep of Israel, and basically the woman says, you know, even dogs, what's she say, like, yeah, dogs even get crumbs anyway. At least you can throw a crumb to me. And Jesus says, you know, I've never seen faith like this. And we don't entirely know what to do with Jesus with that, but the way that he looked at this woman, and either he's playing a little bit of a rhetorical game and he knows all along and kind of winks at her and says like, I'm with you, or the way in which he allows himself in that moment to realize something about this woman and responds faithfully to her when no one in that culture would have dared allow themselves to be corrected by her. It's just such a moment of solidarity with the poor. So just again and again, we see Jesus seeing people for who they are, seeing through the place they occupy in society. But this is so key for him to say, like, if that's the case with who Jesus was, then we need to think through his meaning today in the same kind of terms. What does it mean that the church is largely segregated? What does it mean that parts of the church are wealthy and parts are poor? Like, what does that, for sermon, those are very, very important questions. Language here, for those people, this is for who he calls the disinherited. Christianity has often been sterile and of little avail. The conventional Christian word is muffled, confused, and vague. And the reason he says this, I think, is really very important. He says this because Christianity has presumed power. And so sometimes we think the way for Christians to love those whose backs are against the wall is essentially to kind of reach down to them and to sort of say, we have something to offer you. And if I asked, I mean, probably you've had experiences like that in churches, either from being reached down to or doing the reaching down, where you sort of have presumed, oh, Christianity has something to offer. We're the ones here with something to offer, something to give. And so it's our job to give it. It's our job to be, what's the right word I'm looking for? It's our job to be good examples with that power. Like we want to use it for others and not for ourselves. There's even some of this, frankly, in Houghton's kind of some of our language that we use about developing scholar servants, right? That's our language that we want to use for the kind of students we turn out. And a sense of, I mean, there's kind of baked into that the assumption that Houghton students will be of a position that is able to serve and to sort of, to magnanimously use our power, which we're presumed to have, for those who are less fortunate. And what he says is basically, poor people can't imagine themselves as part of such a religion. Like if your back is against the wall, you're not necessarily thinking, how can I become a scholar servant, right? Your questions are entirely different that you're coming to this with. And so maybe it demands that we look at Jesus a little bit differently in terms of, he's not the one who's here to sort of get you on in the more powerful group, which can then give away that power for others. But maybe he has something to say to you just where you are, rather than making you one of the more fortunate who can then help the less fortunate. He does this less fortunate thing. Page 2 is where he kind of unpacks that. Again and again, our missionary appeal is on the basis of the Christian responsibility to the needy, the ignorant, and the so-called backward peoples of the earth. There's a certain grandeur and nobility in administering to one another's need out of one's fullness and plenty. And yeah, I mean, when I think about ways in which missions have often been talked about in our context at Houghton, and also just kind of in the kind of Christianity I grew up in, there's that idea. I mean, we wouldn't use the word backward peoples anymore, but that sense of like, we have something to give. We are the ones with something to offer. Victoria, maybe I'll have egg on my face after asking you this question, but like, I know that when I went to seminary, I was very surprised because at Houghton, when there were white students who wanted to do kind of mission work, they readily assumed I can sort of raise money from family and friends to do mission work, and I'll kind of raise support that way. And then my African-American friends were almost always surprised by that because there's not the same culture of like raising support from the community to go do something like that. Is that true? Or
Yeah, you know.
I mean, it's very generous, don't get me wrong, but it's not the same. It's not like we have something to give so you can go take it somewhere.
You know, because it's almost like we have like our own community. And it's like, you know, when we were talking about last week about the community, you know, of the household community and then the community, right. It's like we will let's do it ourselves. I mean, even now with all this going on, there's a lot of young people who have, it's like a wake up. All this is going on, they're woke up. So now they're looking at how can we help ourselves.
Right.
And so they're looking at, how do we bring in people to help us with businesses? How do we set up things to, now when the call comes for somebody who needs to be a board member, let's train our own people to be a board member. Law enforcement, let's train our own people, kind of like homegrown. So and that's that kind of mindset that we have. So it's like everything is always, even growing up, is like everything was always kept at home. What was done at home stayed at home. That kind of attitude. And so but if somebody came out, I don't know, giving a handout, that wasn't, I don't know, growing up, you didn't see that a lot.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. Yeah. Josiah and Dave and Robert, this is just reminding me of a sermon that would have happened while I think, were students at Houghton. There was a Haitian pastor who came from somewhere in New York City, I think from one of the larger Wesleyan churches that is in Brooklyn. And she gave a message on God giving Joseph a dream. I remember the sermon like it was yesterday. God gave Joseph a dream, and his dream was kind of for his flourishing and his prospering. And Joseph dared to kind of follow that dream and trust that God had good things for him, even when he was in jail. And it was fascinating after that sermon to watch people unpack it, because there were some people who said to me, that just doesn't sound like a very biblical sermon to me. And I said, why doesn't it sound biblical? And they said, because it made it sound like God wants you personally to do well or to prosper, when God doesn't really care about how that story works out for you. He cares that you become the kind of person who gives yourself away, And so there were a lot of students like that, and it did kind of break down along color lines, right? But there were lots of, particularly African-American and our Caribbean students who took that sermon and were like, that was so wonderful, because, being at Houghton in a rural area, as Victoria said, like feeling like the only one here, and it's hard to know, does God really have something in mind for me being here? But I feel like I need to keep pressing on. And they're like, that sermon gave me the power to keep pressing on. And it almost perfectly illustrates what Thurman is talking about here, the idea of what's God's ultimate vision for our lives. I mean, I don't think it's either one of those visions is necessarily right or wrong, but that idea of like what it means to be biblical in some traditions can only be understood as, I need to understand who I am so I can give myself away, as opposed to God wants me to kind of grow and flourish and change. So, yeah.
Can I just add also, when you were talking about that video, how with Jacob, another thing is that God will make a way. God will make a way, because that's what we always told. When you're trying in your journey, God will make a way out of no way. Just lean and trust on Him. And that's how we, I can always, it's like you said, you could hear that sermon now. I can hear my grandmother. God will, nothing's too big for our God. So it's like all things are possible through God. Who Christ strengthens me. So it's like God will, because that to me that's like all the. Growing up, that's always heard too. God will make a way out of no way. And so that's when you're talking about that story, of Joseph. That's what happened. God made a way. Here he was in prison, and God made a way. And so that's how we were kind of raised on.
Yeah. And it's so important, I think, for those traditions to be in conversation with each other. Like it because, again, there's nothing about God will make a way that should threaten the perspective of God wants me to give myself away, right? But and it's good, frankly. I mean, I think it's good that people who do come from a place where they have more care about giving that away. I don't necessarily want my privileged white kids to necessarily think God wants me to be happy and have everything I want. Like that's not it either. But you can understand why there can be a conversation where a Christian who doesn't have their back against the wall understands it really differently, and sometimes it doesn't even sound like the same Jesus that we're talking about. And it's really important to bridge that gap, because, well, frankly, for the life of America right now, it's very important that these two kinds of Christianity learn to talk to each other better. So, yeah. The conversation. So this is the conversation that Mary was referencing before. It is a very challenging conversation that he has. I don't know quite what I would do if I heard I think you're a traitor to all the darker peoples of the earth. Like, especially if I've been the dean of the chapel at Howard, and like this is someone who, in terms of African American Christianity, would have been at the very top of the heap. And so to hear from someone, you're a traitor to the darker peoples of the earth, must just have thrown him for a loop. And I appreciate, though, how he lets the conversation happen to him, and how it leads him into thinking about, okay, well, what is it that I think about this Jesus? Like, why does Jesus have this hold on me? And why do I think that following this Jesus can really lead me to a healthier way of understanding the world around me? So we'll dig into his interpretation of Jesus. Maybe we'll break now rather than getting into a whole new point, just because we're right up a bit kind of around the halfway point. So we'll come back at 8:05, and then we'll jump into the picture of Jesus and kind of his understanding, as Brian was pointing out, like Jesus was a Jew, and we'll get into that kind of stuff. So we'll get back about 8:05. Okay, take 10 or 11, grab some coffee, whatever you need to do. See you soon. All right. Everybody come on back. Josiah, where's that picture taken that is your away picture? I was trying to like place that. That one, yeah. Can't hear you.
That was at the Gold Dome M&T Bank, downtown Buffalo.
Oh,
I worked in the back office there for the first year and a half, year and 3/4. I was at the bank. So one day I was out walking and I took a picture in front of the Gold Dome.
So much swag.
it's a great look. Yeah, it's daunting to me. I mean, I'm glad you just look like a normal person now, because it would be a lot if that picture were up the whole time. Like sometimes when I'm teaching online, people keep their cameras off, and I don't know if I could deal with it if I had to look at that the whole time. It would be too much.
So when I Zoom with my pastor, he's got one where he's taken Photoshop to whiten his smile too, nonetheless. So he's got this really bright smile.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Well, the things we didn't know we'd be doing with ourselves here in this in 2020, how important a Zoom picture would be, and a mask. My daughter was all happy, my 4-year-old today, when she went to preschool. She's like, my mask matches. I was like, wow, we're at this. Oh, we're all going to look back on this and laugh and hug each other. All right, let me jump back in. Let's see. So we will press on here for another few minutes. So this is where we left off, just talking about his interpretation of who Jesus is. And for him, this is the way to make sense of how to follow Jesus when so many Christians seem kind of opposed to who he is. So again, we'll take time to think about this, but the first thing is Jesus was a Jew. And Thurman says it's impossible for Jesus to be understood outside of the sense of community which Israel held with God. I think that's a really insightful statement. Not just that there was something kind of sociologically real about being Jewish at that time, and not just that they were under occupation and blah, 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 but the Jewish understanding of God as uniquely relational. When we think about stories from the Old Testament, like Abraham arguing with God, and kind of reminding God of his character when God is threatening to destroy a city, remember? And Abraham says, well, what if there are 50 righteous people there? And God's like, I guess I probably shouldn't destroy it for 50 righteous people. And Abraham like talks him down, and eventually they get to like, for 10 righteous people, I won't destroy the city. However you choose to interpret that text, whether you understand like a literal conversation happening, I don't know how you want to interpret that text. But what it reveals is a really different way of understanding God than, say, the Greeks might have had, right? The idea of God as this kind of being that's entirely beyond us. There are gods that create people to do kind of their dirty work, but God doesn't enter into relationship with people. For Thurman, like the sense of community, I mean, his language, the sense of community that Israel held with God is really important to nurturing Jesus' sense of who he was as the Son of God. Does that make sense? There's so much that we could say here in terms of the great biblical question of what Jesus knew and when he knew it about himself. That's something that scholars love to sort of debate about, is, how early on in Jesus' life did he realize who he was and what he was here to do? We get one little snippet from the canonical Gospels about, Jesus as a 12-year-old boy at the temple, right? But that's all we really have. And of course, the early church was fascinated with what Jesus must have been like as a little boy, and they wrote stories about it that have shown up in Gospels that didn't make their way into the canon. Stories about how he, one of the best stories about that is Jesus as a little boy on the playground fashioning little birds out of clay and then breathing on them, and the birds came to life and flew away. That was a legend that was told about the little boy Jesus. It's in a book, I think, called The Infancy Gospel of Thomas. That was one of the books that was passed around, that when it came time to determine whether the canon of the Bible was left out of the canon because it was determined to be not written by an apostle. But that kind of story about Jesus fascinated people, and the fact that Jesus, at least in some way, continued to develop and grow is really challenging for us. I was reflecting on this in this panel discussion I mentioned the other night. There's a text in Hebrews, although he was a son, meaning son of God, he learned obedience, which is a fascinating thing to think about, Jesus having to learn obedience. And every time I'd heard that text before, I had always assumed, oh yeah, well, I mean, when he was like a boy, he learned to obey. But text said he learned obedience through suffering, which almost certainly refers to the cross or the passion. So even in some way, he continues to develop and grow. He gives himself over to the process of being human, is what I'm saying. And that deep relational sense he had with God, of I'm in a living relationship with the living God. We go back and forth and talk to each other. I'm one of his chosen people. That's really important to understanding who Jesus was. And so it's partially, I just don't want us to jump to only the, okay, he's an oppressed person in an empire, but no, his Jewishness also gives him a sense of what it means to be chosen by God. That, without the Semitic side of our faith, I don't think we would really fully appreciate that sense of chosenness and relationship with God. So Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was a poor Jew, and he points out that the sacrifice brought for him at his dedication was 2 turtle doves, which was a sacrifice that would have been given by a family that didn't have enough to afford a fancier sacrifice. And so the reminder that Jesus didn't come born in the world with a silver spoon in his mouth means that he also saw the world like a poor person saw it. Again, really very crucial. Chastening and challenging, like to give voice to some things Mary said before. For those of us who are not born as poor people, it should make us think. I mean, this is part of the thing, is that Jesus regularly challenged people who were not ready to examine themselves. And the temptation when I hear this is to say, I understand Jesus fairly well because I understand the Bible. So the fact that he was poor shouldn't play into it. But it's good for me to be chastened by the fact that he saw it in a way that I might not initially be able to see it. That's not to say that I can't develop sensitivity and that I can't better understand what it might mean to be in poverty. But the fact is, I've never really been in poverty. And so I don't understand it from the inside out. It's frankly, not to get too much spiritual formation here, but that's frankly one of the reasons why Christians historically practice disciplines of denial that kind of put us in a place of solidarity with those who don't have enough. Part of the reason Christians fast is to experience from the inside what it's like to not have enough to eat, to develop solidarity with those who don't have enough to eat. So that's designed to help build not just a head sensitivity, but a heart sensitivity. So Jesus was a poor Jew. And third thing, Jesus was a Jew during Roman occupation. So he was a Jew during a time when, I love how Thurman talks about how there was not just, how do you put it? He's talking about like there's a threat to Judaism, not just kind of a sentimental threat, but like a real sense of this way of looking at God, this way of looking at the world might be extinct. Like, the Jewish people might cease to exist. Their way of wanting to narrate the history of the world might come to an end. Their way of understanding God might be lost to history. When we talk about the biblical passage about God inhabiting the praise of his people, we are coming at a time when the praise of his people is under threat. And so for a very relational God, if the people are extinguished, then who does that God have left? If there are no praises, where does that God live? I mean, that's the question that the Jews are feeling kind of from the inside out at that point. So he is a Jew, he's a poor Jew, and he's a Jew during a time of extreme, kind of an existential threat to both their people and their religion, their way of understanding the world. So for Thurman, again, we can't just view Jesus as a guy who came to sort of set up a plan of salvation that could have been done anytime, anywhere. It's important that he was who he was. And from there, he goes on to say, okay, here's how Jesus could have dealt with it. And I think this is masterful, the way he sort of walks through the different options that Jews had at that time and the way the different Jews took those options, right? So here's the option, right? I'm sorry, the historical facts don't obscure Jesus, but reveal him. We talked about that. Jesus speaks within and to the needs of his time. 4 options for how to deal with this reality. 1, he talks about non-resistance and imitation. And by this, he means people who do not resist the Roman occupation and, in fact, seek to copy and cooperate with the oppressors. I, for one, welcome our new leaders. These folks who had the means and had the social standing to sort of throw their countrymen under the bus and cooperate in order to sort of curry favor with the oppressors, with the people who had the power. And here he says this is what the Sadducees did. There's the non-resistance but reduced contact idea, and this he says the Pharisees did. There's a contempt for the Romans, a clear realization that the Romans mean everything that's bad. We're not going to cozy up to the Romans. We're not going to pretend to be Roman, but we're also going to do whatever we can to build up a world that is impermeable to day-to-day contact with the Romans, or not contact, but day-to-day kind of, the Romans are not going to have control over our temple, the way that we do things. I am going to completely do my own thing. And I'm not going to resist the Romans, but I'm going to kind of spiritualize this reality. I'm going to put it away from me and say, I'm going to throw myself into keeping the law. I'm going to throw myself into the minutia of what it means to be Jewish. And I'm not going to let them have my heart, but I'm also not going to take up arms against them. So there's that option. It talks about the armed resistance that we would have seen in the Zealots, people who said, we need to take up arms and fight back. And we might die trying, but I'd rather die trying than die not trying. And so, and again, we see Jesus including people from these different camps in his choice of disciples, which is fascinating, and always begs the question of whether these folks would have identified as zealots on the other side of this. You know, like it's just, and of course we don't have any neat answers to those questions. But this is another option, right? And we all recognize that's an option. So we can say, I'm tired of it, I'm not going to take it anymore, and we're going to push back. Then he says, here's Jesus' alternative. The kingdom of heaven is in us, or we could say among us, right? That question of whether the kingdom of heaven is within you, that ought to, at least to my way of thinking, ought to be understood in the plural sense of the kingdom of heaven is made real among you in your gathering, as opposed to the kingdom of heaven living in your heart. But Thurman pushes me a little bit on that and talks about how it is an external reality. It's among us. We are the kingdom is here with us, but it also lives inside of us in a place that can't be touched by outside forces. The kingdom of heaven is in us. And he talks about how that's, that's resented by some people because it feels like betrayal, right? The zealots don't like this because Jesus is not taking up arms, and so he appears to be insufficiently, you know, when people are not angry, when someone's not angry at something that you're angry at, you often don't think they agree with you, even if they actually do agree with you about something, but they're not moved to anger in the same way that you are. We forget that anger is often doesn't have everything to do with the presenting issue, but often has to do with some internal issues as well. And so there's all kinds of reasons why two people who might see things exactly the same way, one might think this is an outrage, and one might think this is wrong, but not an outrage. I'm not outraged. And yet in our culture today, we only recognize each other by our anger more than we do by actual shared beliefs about things. I think it's a very, anyway, you can get into that another time if you want, the way that anger is behind a lot of this. But for him, he's just recognizing like, yeah, the Zealots aren't going to like this. Thurman fleshes out some of this idea about the kingdom of heaven here on page 18. The idea being, I guess, that Jesus understands his approach to be a way that we understand who we are with God enough that we don't have to give ourselves over to what other people want us to do. Does that make sense? Like he gets into it more on 18, like the top of 18. He recognized with authentic realism that anyone who permits another to determine the quality of his inner life gives into the hands of the other the keys to his destiny. That is a marvelous turn of a phrase. Anyone who permits another to determine the quality of his inner life gives into the hands of the other the keys to his destiny. Saying basically, the reason that I can know the kingdom of heaven is within me and not respond with the anger of the zealots is because I recognize who I am. And if I allow you to provoke me into an anger that I don't wish to define me, I've given you the power over me that you want to have. But if I can choose to not be angry, if I can choose to not respond with violence because I know who I am in a given moment and I can act with that steady awareness of who I am in the moment, like we don't become who we are through violence, I guess, is what he's saying. And again, we'll pause here and just say, you can see this all over King, like 10 years after Thurman is writing this. Like this motivates King to understand what nonviolence is. King is so far from being passive, but he understands nonviolence as a tool of radical self-control in the face of radical evil. Believing that the Holy Spirit of God gives us the power of self-control in order to reveal evil for what it is. The more that we can be the people we know God has called us to be, the greater the contrast between us and those who are consumed by anger and threatening others with their anger. So again, I mean, you can just picture, again, if you want to picture the two men sitting around watching the World Series talking about these ideas, it's just fascinating to me to see, because it, you know, as he goes on there on page 18, if a man knows just what he can do to you or what he can say against you to make you lose your temper, then he can always keep you under subjection. And again, just as you picture King training the nonviolent resistance to say, don't let anybody have power over you to make you react in a way that's not who you are. You are a beloved child of God. That is who you are. If you stop acting like it, then you're not going to be it anymore. So it's just, again, this is behind so much, frankly, it's behind so much of American and church history that happens in the coming years. Now, I think what's really fascinating, right, is that Jesus, he talks about how Jesus is resisting the state, although in a non-violent way. He's resisting the Romans and saying, Romans, you're not gonna have this power over me, but I'm not going to give myself over to an armed conflict. He goes from there to talk about how Paul may have understood this differently, because he asks, like, basically, how then could Paul sound so very different than Jesus in the way that Paul talked about the state, having respect for the governing authorities, all of this. It's just so fascinating to hear him tell the story about his grandmother, who he would read the text for. And he said, I might read many of the more devotional Psalms, I might read some of Isaiah, the Gospels, but never from Paul. And the sense of, you know, when he asked why, you know, always the white minister, to his grandmother who had been a slave, always the white minister used as his text something from Paul. Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters, as unto Christ. And his point is that Paul was in such a different social context. Like, Paul didn't have anything to fear from the state in the same way that Jesus did. Paul was a Roman citizen. So of course he's more inclined to sort of say, the state's here for your good. So it's, again, we don't need to bring those two. I mean, it's good to bring some harmony, I think, to those two, to realize, okay, they were inspired by the same God, but you can understand how they came to different conclusions about how we should feel about those who are pushing back on us, right? So anyway, that whole section I thought was really, really fascinating to read about. Victoria, when you nodded as I was saying that, would there be similar feelings about Paul in your upbringing? I'm just curious.
my grandfather, yes, he would talk about that, because, about, with his father, always talk, they, when the men, just as they said, as they came,
Yeah.
but that was the only thing that was preached.
Right.
To keep them in line, so he would, so he would tell stories of that, about, that's how they kept them in line, and, with their mindset, you're a slave, because look, it's in the Bible. God says,
Yeah. Yeah.
we're doing it right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. That really should, again, challenge us to realize, like, I don't think it's always bad advice to respect the governing authorities, but we should be really careful when we're thinking about that for other people and like how that, it's good for me to think about how I ought to respect governing authorities, but I also have to be really careful before saying, the best thing for you to do is really to respect governing authorities.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. So I don't know if you have any other kind of takes on Jesus, his view of who Jesus is. He's going to pivot from here and sort of say, to make comparisons about what it's like to be African American in the time he's writing this book in the 1940s. So do you have anything kind of on the theological or biblical side of this that you want to ask about before we take that pivot, we'll take that turn? Anything you want to say? Anything that stood out to you that was new, challenging, inspiring in this first part? I'll assume it was all inspiring then. All right. So we'll jump over to the next. So compares this with the situation of being Black in America today. This, again, published in 1949. Bottom of page 23, the striking similarity between the social position of Jesus in Palestine and that of the vast majority of American Negroes is obvious to anyone who tarries long over the facts. That's a really, anytime someone says, well, it should be obvious, it's interesting because for many people that would not be obvious, right? Like I think for those of us who have not experienced it, it wouldn't necessarily seem to jump out at us. One of the books that I always lead with students down here is a book by James Cone called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And he talks about how the obvious connections between the state-sponsored crucifixion of Jesus and the mob violence of lynching, there was obvious connection, but yet preachers couldn't really see it. Artists saw it, and artists would often bring it out in song and in painting. But preachers, be they Black or white, preachers often couldn't really see it. They didn't make those connections as easily as artists did. And so it chastens us because I think it's good for us it's good for us to realize the things that seem obvious to us don't always seem obvious to everyone. And I'm glad Thurman brought it out here, because the more we think about it, I think, right, it would be. It would be obvious. And he goes on and says, we're dealing here with conditions that produce essentially the same psychology. What it would feel like to be a poor Jew under oppression would be very much like what it would be like to feel like an African American in the 1940s. And he goes on to talk about there are no basic citizenship rights, no fundamental protection. Their status as citizens has never been clearly defined. And he, let's see, where did I want to read? Yeah, that second paragraph on page 24. So here's what Jesus did. Living in a climate of deep insecurity, had to find some other basis on which to establish a sense of well-being. Jesus, as he swims in the world as an oppressed Jew in under Roman authority, has to find some other way except societal acceptance to understand who he is. Does that make sense? Like he needs something else to sort of stand on, to sort of give him a backbone and understand his identity. And he says, deep from within that order, he projected a dream. And again, we can hear some King elements here as he talks about the dream, the logic of which would give to everybody the needful security. There would be room for all, and no man would be a threat to his brother. The kingdom of God is within. That's his picture of how the kingdom of what the kingdom of God looks like. Jesus comes to establish this to sort of demonstrate to people who they really are in a society that can't see them for who they are. And so because they can't see them as they are, can't tell them that's who they are. And so he says, basically, the kingdom of God is here within us. It doesn't reside in the hand of the Romans. The Romans don't have the right to define who I am as a citizen or not as a citizen. I am a member of the kingdom of God. Again, I am somebody. You can, that paragraph there, again, I'm sure percolates with King over the rest of his life and probably culminates in his I Have a Dream speech, I would imagine. That dream language shows up again. If you trace King's preaching at all, the dream motif comes up a lot of times before the big I Have a Dream speech, and it kind of develops. But I think this is some of the roots of King's dream idea here about years before the culmination of that speech. So that's his picture, right? Like when you're in this place, you feel under existential threat. You don't know if you're going to survive another day. You're terrified, and you can't look to any identity the world gives you as your identity. And so in that moment, you have to own, I'm a member of the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is here among me, among us. It's in here. No one can touch it. It's among us, and so no one can get to it. It's mine. And he's going to go deeper into that. But that idea of like, I am somebody, I am a person, I am God's beloved child, you're going to start hearing that and you're going to think, I heard that somewhere before. And it's Nouwen talk, right? He didn't get this from Nouwen. But I mean, that idea of like, what's most important to know about yourself? I am God's beloved child. Remember when we read Life of the Beloved and we asked, like, does it sound a little narcissistic to think that prayer is the voice that says good things to me? Remember that question? Like, Thurman is essentially saying the same thing here, which is to develop a relationship with God is to hear the truth about me. And the more that truth is rooted in who I am, the more I can actually live like it wherever I am. So, again, I don't know what you made of this first chapter. I don't know if there's things you want to say about it. To me, it's a really incisive, I mean, it's an excellent, you can imagine him as an excellent preacher for one thing, because he makes just turns of a phrase here and there that are amazing. But such an incisive point that helps us, I think, get a new vision on Jesus' ministry that is really explicit, or really explicitly designed for those times, but also it's just the kind of stuff we've been talking about that Christians would have always said, the most important thing we can know about ourselves, that we're God's beloved. So anything you want to say on that before we jump into what he does with the rest of the book? Is basically says, here are the pitfalls, right? Chapters 2, 3, and 4, these are all things that you can opt for instead of understanding yourself as God's beloved, understanding yourself as a part of the kingdom of God. But anything to say here at the outset, though, before we jump into those things? Anything you noticed? Anything to bring up? All right, well, today we're just going to spend time with one of these things, and then we'll get into the rest. We're going to spend time talking about fear. And again, I hope that it sounds like some of these things, or it sound like authors we've talked about along the way. But fear, to have your back against the wall, is to always have fear as an option. And he does some amazing stuff really in here, I think, in talking about how violence kind of underpins so much of this fear. So he does this on page 27. I forget to have your back against the wall is always to have fear as an option. Page 27, he says, it's clear that fear arises out of the sense of isolation and helplessness in the face of the varied dimensions of violence to which the underprivileged are exposed. Violence, precipitate and stark, is the sire of the fear of such people. It's spawned by the perpetual threat of violence everywhere. Here, and again, I don't know how far you all have gone down roads of counseling or different kinds of therapy. The way he talks about fear and traumatic episodes and violence, to me, it's very timely. You can push back and disagree if you don't find it that way. But the way he talks about how, when there's an animal that has been threatened with violence again and again, the animal sort of carries around the result of that violence with them and always reacts as if that violence is a possibility. So my mom growing up had a beagle that anytime the family got out scissors was just terrified. We don't know why. There's a rescue dog, but something at some point happened that dog just learned to associate scissors with a lot of pain. And what Thurman is saying is, for dispossessed people always, there's the threat of violence. To me, this is one of the most painful difficulties about our national dialogue right now around race is that there, I think, is an expression of pain happening, that it often appears very important sometimes to white folks to say, you don't have that thing you're afraid of. It's you're overreacting. It's not a thing. You know, there are also many white people who are attacked by police, this sort of thing. It's very painful to see that conversation happen, because what's happening is right. The realization of being under threat is it's not always even what's the word I'm looking for? It's something we carry around in ways that even when we are actually safe can feel deeply unsafe. And so the response is not then to tell that person who feels unsafe, oh, no, it's inconvenient for me that you feel unsafe. Please stop feeling unsafe because it's making me uncomfortable. But to sort of say, how did we get here and what can we do is a really important point. And so Thurman just really challenges us to think about, and actually there's some really interesting research done on the genetic results of that there are differences in the genes of African Americans as opposed to Africans, as opposed to white folks, in terms of some traumatic episodes that have had genetic repercussions for later generations. Yeah, and of course it matches very closely the idea of sin that we would all say is biblical, that sin has effects beyond generations. And so, you know, when we think about what it might mean to be a member of a race that until very recently, humanly speaking, was enslaved, until very, very recently was segregated, of course there are just lingering effects of that in the way, and so the way that is dealt with such lack of empathy in our culture just really, really pains me. What Thurman is saying here is, I think, really, really important. When there's kind of a dead weight advantage that one culture has had over another for a long time, the threat of violence hangs in the air heavy and needs work to kind of get through it. And so what he says then is fear becomes kind of a safety device to have some measure of emotional protection. Like that becomes a logical response. If you're afraid, it gives you, how do I put it? Right. I think he compares it to like having a snake slide under your bed or something. He has a story like that somewhere in here where he talks about like when he was visiting somewhere and there was a snake under the bed, or maybe it was a bug. I can't remember what it was, but you know, something crawling under the bed that he learned very quickly, like his fear kept him safe from. Right. And so the sense of this is not a good place for me to be, I'm not going to put my feet down right here, that's what keeps him safe in the middle of it. And so fear becomes a very natural sort of response, and it becomes a safety device kind of for emotional protection. I don't want to get hurt again. I will not get hurt again as long as I don't have this kind of uncomfortable interaction. So I'm going to cling to that fear because that fear keeps me safe. Now, what he does that's interesting is he talks about how fear then kind of leads on a kind of cycle, right? Fear leads to segregation, obviously. Like if what he's talking about is to be Black in America is to be a little bit afraid of what will happen with white folks, the natural desire to stay away leads to segregation, and segregation starts to seem natural. And if it starts to seem natural, it starts to seem moral, right? Like if it starts to seem natural, like we say, well, that's just the way it is. And then we develop a theological rationale for why things are the way they are. And before you know it, we have a very high barrier that has its roots in fear. And I appreciate how he's writing, of course, to African-American folks saying, be careful about how you fear. But of course, there's so much fear on the white side of the line too, right? That has kept this wall building really high. Fear of what, you know, certainly at this time, fear of, oh, it's fascinating. I watched a documentary the other day about 1962 Mississippi with forced integration, you know, and to be 13 years before this, like just a terrifying time, like to look back and say, right, this wasn't so long ago. But as Thurman is writing this, like that there are places in the country where he's not allowed to go because people are fearful of him, and frankly fearful of recognizing the evils of slavery and segregation, and fearing the revenge or justice, which there might be. And so trying to keep people away, there's so much fear on both sides that has just led to this giant wall. So in a way, he says, fear is going to be natural. We have to work against it. But it's going to, because it leads to something really dangerous societally. He also talks about how we don't just develop bad effects societally, but also for us personally. Fear, this is on page 35. Fear becomes acute in the form of panic or rage only at the moment when what has been threat becomes violence. But the mere anticipation of such an encounter is overwhelming because the odds are basically uneven. So when we live in fear, again, it does become disproportionate to what's going on, but he goes on to say the result is the dodging of all encounters. When we're afraid of what's happening, we will push people away. And the effect is nothing short of disaster in the organism. Studies show fear actually causes chemical changes in the body, affecting the bloodstream and the muscular reactions, preparing the body either for fight or for flight. The idea that to constantly live in this place where I know I'm going to be forced into a situation where I'll need to run or fight, over time takes its toll. And so he says fear kills. It's degenerative. Like if we don't find a way to deal with fear, it will literally kill us, from Thurman's perspective. So for him, then, he wants to think, he goes on at the bottom of 35, this fear originally serves as a protective mechanism, but it finally becomes death for the self. The power that saves turns executioner. What a marvelous turn of a phrase. And again, no matter your experience with fear, I hope you can see little strands of that in your own experience where fear really does make us die to ourselves in little ways. It doesn't have to be the huge ways he's talking about here. We can talk about something simpler. I think about, like, for example, when I was a kid, I wasn't a very good artist, and I turned in a project and I got a bad grade on it in 3rd grade, and my teacher wrote something snarky on about it, which made me really afraid to try art, to try drawing again. And an art professor at Houghton said, you've got to get over that. Like, what is wrong with you? Like, letting a 3rd grade teacher sort of make you afraid of something, like, you can't let that happen anymore. So this happens in lots and lots of ways in our lives, some of them really tiny and some of them in these really, really big ways. So here's how he goes in. He says, this is what Jesus does, right? This is how Jesus deals with this fear. And this is on page 36 to 38. For Jesus, let me see if I can find the exact quote here. This is the bottom of 38. This is good. The core of the analysis of Jesus, and this is his analysis of the Sermon on the Mount, is that man is a child of God, the God of life that sustains all of nature and guarantees all of the intricacies of the life process itself. A couple sentences down. This idea that God is mindful of the individual is of tremendous import in dealing with fear as a disease. In this world, the socially disadvantaged man is constantly given a negative answer to the most important personal questions upon which their mental health depends. Who am I? What am I? Do you hear him saying? Like, he's saying basically, within this culture, Jews are asking the Romans, who am I? And what are they hearing back? You're nothing. And he's saying, in America, Black folks are asking white folks, who am I? And they're hearing back, you're nothing. And he says, the Sermon on the Mount reveals to us, no, you are a child of God. You are not nothing. The God who guarantees everything about life itself, the God who sort of sets this whole thing in motion, that God is mindful of you as an individual. And you are a beloved child of God. Again, you could swap out a paragraph of Nouwen's at random here, because that's exactly the point of Life of the Beloved, isn't it? This is what Nouwen says to Fred. You're God's beloved child. And this is what Thurman is saying to the African-American folks he's writing to, and he's saying this is what Jesus is saying to the people who he's talking to. He shares with him his grandmother, who says to him basically how in contrast with these sermons that the white pastor would give, there would be a slave minister who would come in and preach. And he would say, you are not, uses the N-word, you are not slaves, you are God's children. So to picture a slave minister again, exactly on the same page as Henry Nouwen, and how crucial it is to understand this about yourself if you want to walk in the world with your head held high. It's just, to me, like God, the idea that God is mindful of the individual, and that you're not just a member of a disinherited class, but you are somebody. And so he goes on from there and says, that's not everything, right? Like that doesn't solve everything about the problem, but it's a start. And the start, he says, like on page 40, 41 is where he gets into that. Like it shifts the basis of his relationship with all of his fellows. He recognizes at once that to fear a man, whatever that man's power over him, is a basic denial of the integrity of his very life. Again, this is like super spiritual formation language, right? To live in fear of another person is to inaccurately understand who you are in relationship to that person. That's not to say that this person can't do violence to you, can't harm you, doesn't have power over you. Certainly, any fair estimation of the facts acknowledges, yes, there is some difference here where this person has power that I don't have in this situation. But I don't have this existential fear that somehow the God of the universe has lost sight of me. The more I have this deep sense that the God of the universe sees me, the more that I can operate with that person in a way that, in which I act like I'm somebody. And again, if we remove ourselves from the intense situation that Thurman's talking about and just think about kind of our ordinary day-to-day interactions with people, that realization can make us really much more comfortable and confident sharing who we are in the middle of a situation, right? Kind of like we talked about in this class, like don't be afraid to say what's on your mind as you're processing this, because there's nothing personal of you that's at stake here. So you can speak freely without being afraid. You can also really listen freely without being afraid, right? Like that's the other thing. Often we like get into these situations and when we're arguing as a nation or arguing as a church, we shift into that fight or flight thing too. And we, not only do we feel like I'm not allowed to say anything, but I also can't really listen to what someone's saying to me as a person would with a person. And that's just not true. Like in any of those situations, we have that agency within us given us by the power of the Spirit because of who God is revealed to be in Jesus. And that's just such a powerful thing to carry around. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like for him, it's that, like you say, it doesn't solve problems, but it makes us able to begin a conversation in a healthy way. It makes us able to take steps as people take steps because we realize now the full agency we have as people. We don't have to be just members of classes anymore. And he gets into that a little bit, like further down in 41, like when we realize this, we have the ability to make an objective, detached appraisal of other people, particularly one's antagonists. So if I get an email from someone on campus, I've got a few people like this on campus where when I get an email from them, I get really nervous. And I begin to feel that like, this person, I know they're going to say something that's like challenging me and I don't want to have to think about it right now. And I'm frustrated. And if I had my way, I wouldn't even open that email because I just know what it's going to be. I've given that person a lot of power over me. And I have consigned myself to inaction. And I've also made it impossible for me to hear what that person might have to teach me. But when I know who I am, I can go into that situation without fear. Again, it's the people who have been through Houghton have heard me preach the sermon 100 times, but that's the Maundy Thursday kind of text where Jesus is at the table, right, with his disciples and is able to serve. And the text says, because he knew that the Father had given all things into his hand, and he knew where he came from, and he knew where he was going. He knew that. Because he knew that, he was able to operate in that situation doing amazing, unexpected things, which turned the world on its head, turned the whole situation on its head. It's because he understood who he was, and so he could understand who God was, and he understood who other people were in that situation. All right, I've preached a lot. Do you have anything to say? Pushback, feedback, questions? When you think about fear in your own life, does he describe it well. I feel like for me anyway, Thurman and Nouwen both have this wonderful, clear understanding of the inner life that I really resonate with. Like when he talks about fear as a safety device that keeps me from exploring my full potential, I get it. When he talks about fear being degenerative, I get it. When he talks about an understanding of who I am as the antidote to fear, and an antidote which sometimes I don't want to take because I almost want to cling to some of that fear, I get that too. So I don't know, thoughts, reactions from you on it. I don't know if I had any other points here that I want to, oh yeah, we talked about all this, didn't we? Yeah. Oh, look at that. We'll leave those questions for next time. That'll help us get into it. But anything you want to say before we depart? Any of those, anything that's kind of struck you in Thurman's analysis, particularly of fear and God announcing us, or Jesus announcing us as child of God as antidote to fear?
I guess I thought it was interesting when I think of child of God and fear. And on page 43, there's a sentence that says the psychological effect on the individual of the conviction that he is a child of God gives a note of integrity to whatever he does.
Yeah.
It takes that fear away when you truly believe that you're a child of God. You get that chest puffed out feeling. And integrity for what you're speaking now has some weight behind it. You don't have the fear of it. You know you have more self-confidence, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Really kind of put fear and child of God together on separate planes, because truly that's what stops you from having that integrity or having that initiative, is the fear of your peers looking at you differently, of not being able to express yourself correctly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, Thurman doesn't go down this road too much, and Nouwen tackles this a lot more in some of his other work, but the idea that sometimes when we go into ministry and think about all the different things that are required of us, we often think about them as like everyone needing to start from ground zero. I've got to lead this Bible study today, and that's got to start from ground zero. I got to preach this sermon. I got to go visit this person. And part of what Nouwen's really good about is talking about how when we understand ourselves as children of God, we can bring ourselves with integrity to all those tasks that make it less about presenting something that we have to build from the ground up and more just expressing what God has given us to express in a given situation. I don't know how to explain it other than some of the pseudo-religious ideas of like flow. It's not quite what I'm saying, that you're just in a flow, but there's an element of that, right? Where it's like, if I get, maybe I shouldn't admit to this. The other day I was like on a Zoom call with someone at the college. I'm doing all these meetings with some different people at the college to talk about some things we're doing in spiritual life. And they were like, oh yeah, you can have the meeting on such and such a date. When you do, could you bring a devotion like to the group? And so I was like, sure, I'll do that. And then I realized completely that I had forgotten to prepare a devotion. Like I had forgotten I said I would do that. And I made the Zoom call, and then they were like, so Mike's got a devotion for us. And I was like, oh man, like this is not good. I don't have anything prepared. So I just started to think through, oh yeah, like this summer I've been living in the Psalms a lot. So I was like, I'm gonna share a Psalm, and I talked about Psalm 39, and just a particular point that really had been on my mind quite a bit throughout that. And I know that the ability to do that was in part because I do it so often. So I'm not saying like it was just a God thing, but there was a chance, I think, to sort of say like, yeah, I mean, this just naturally flowed out of things I've actually been thinking and feeling. And so expressing them to someone right now is natural to do, because I'm not fearful and I don't need to prove myself through this devotion. I don't need to say something great and grand so that this group was going to love me. I just need to share what's on my heart, and maybe it'll touch and maybe it won't, but it's more just an expression of who I am rather than something I have to build. So yeah, I love that sense of integrity. And you can tell someone, I don't know, this might sound too mystic, but I do think there is a note of integrity that sounds when someone is talking that way, when you're like, I recognize that you see that in yourself too. Yeah.
There's a fine line between integrity and just coming off as being pompous.
Sure.
Also,
yep.
you want to be able to sound confident without sound like you're a know-it-all either.
Yeah.
So I guess there's a fine line, because if you're too unfearful, you're going to come off as someone who just plain knows it all.
Yeah, I think you're right. So part of that, again, I think, is that a fearless person knows that they can speak freely and listen freely, right? So, if you're able to then take feedback from other people without that fear, because nothing of you is on the line, right? Like you also, there's no self, this is gonna sound weird, but there's no self there to protect almost, because you recognize my self rests with God. Just like a child is never thinking, how am I gonna make dad love me? Or how am I gonna make these other people? They're just being. And so a child can absorb correction sometimes, not always, but can absorb correction, and also just speaks freely what's on their minds. And that's the goal. That's what keeps us from being just pompous, I think, is when we can really accept correction well too. So other thoughts from you on just this fear, child of God piece? Anything else you want to say? As I hope you can tell, I love talking about Howard Thurman with people. I, you know, having done a little bit of work on King stuff, I find Thurman to be kind of a figure in American history that not many people know about, but actually I think had a really decisive impact on the way that a lot of good that happened in the American civil rights movement happened because of Howard Thurman, and people don't really know about it. For those of us who are in ministry, I hope that that gives you hope as you think about the way that your ministry might touch others, and might shape situations which you're not even aware of as you're having conversations with people. So next week when we're together, we will talk about some other options that are available there for the dispossessed or for the disinherited. We'll talk about deception and hate, and then we'll talk about Jesus' love ethic. That will cover the second half of the book. So we'll leave it there for today. Have a good evening, all. I will stop sharing and say goodbye.